My parents tried to hide my sister's autism by locking her in a closet, so I fought the entire family and the system to save her life, only to discover the family secrets were even darker. My sister was 8 when I first noticed how much she hated eye contact, not just with me, but teachers, parents, everyone. But instead of helping her through it, I started making fun of her for it. "Oh, are you scared we're all secretly Medusa?" I'd say, while pointing and laughing. But then things took a turn. Whenever I tried to be sarcastic, she would start crying and say, "Stop, stop. I don't understand what's going on." Or one time when we were at the mall, she had a full breakdown because she could feel a rock in her shoe. It was then that I realized she most likely had autism. But instead of telling our parents, I tried to get her diagnosed myself. You see, I was 18 at the time, and I knew telling our parents meant them trying to beat the autism out of her. Yes, I know they are crazy. Luckily, the school counselor was extremely helpful, and after a few months of meeting in secret, she was finally diagnosed with autism. It was actually a relief, because at least now I knew how to better take care of her. So in secret, I'd teach her how to stim subtly by encircling her thumb around her finger under her sleeve so our parents wouldn't see. And I even bought her noise-canceling headphones that she could wear whenever she felt overstimulated. Looking back, I don't know why I thought that this was a bulletproof long-term plan. I just thought I knew more than I actually did. So when Lacey turned 12, I told her we were going to watch her favorite movie in front of our parents. Immediately, she started flapping both of her hands super hard like a bird and screamed at an abnormally high pitch for someone excited. A wave of heat washed over because I could practically feel the confusion radiating from my parents. So I began to mimic her exact verbal and physical reaction, pretending it was a quirky inside joke. But over the next few weeks, I wasn't home as much because I took up more shifts to pay for Lacey's therapy. So my parents were actually interacting with her for the first time. Well, girls with autism are typically better at masking, so I thought everything would be fine, but it wasn't. One day, Lacey called me while I was at work. Something she had never done before. When I picked up, she was crying harder than ever, and in between the ASBs, she was begging me to come home. That's when I heard a yelling in the background, and she hung up the phone. My heart stopped. The drive home was 30 minutes, but I made it in 20. I immediately ran up the stairs looking for Lacey, but as I did, I heard a faint banging. It was coming from the closet underneath the stairs. My parents were in their room watching TV, so I don't think they knew I was home. I quietly opened the door, and Lacey ran out, jumping into my arms. I immediately shushed her, and she just nodded like she understood. So there I was, with a 12-year-old girl with low-functioning autism, not knowing what the F to do. But I knew one thing. My parents were worse than I thought, so I quietly carried her out to my car. Turns out, my parents had asked my sister what was going on, and she burst out with the truth, that she had been secretly diagnosed with autism. My dad's hand immediately hit her face. "She's going to poison Jack." My name, my mom yelled, hence why they put her in the closet. Apparently they were waiting for me to come home to see what they should do with her. I felt myself sniffle and choke to hold back tears when she said that, because I knew I had to stay strong. I told her that she would always be safe with me, and no one would ever hurt her again. She held my hand tighter, and I knew she believed me, but I still didn't know what to do. So I just scrolled through my contact list to see what family member would take us in. I ended up deciding on our Aunt Leah because she herself was a little quirky too. I didn't waste any time and told her exactly what was going on with Lacey. She seemed really understanding. I should have known that no one is that friendly to someone they hadn't seen in a while. She told me she'd be happy to take in Lacey, but I couldn't stay because she didn't want men in her house. I told her I respected her wishes and I would be back to visit tomorrow. The last image I saw was Lacey running in excited to hang out with Aunt Leah's daughter, and I never saw her again, not really anyway, because after what Leah did, she was never the same. The next day, she called me from her school, crying even harder than after the incident with our parents. Turns out, Aunt Leah had let her husband do much worse to Lacey. I wish I never drove her there. The school counselor eventually took the phone, explaining that Lacey had arrived that morning in a state of extreme distress, refusing to speak to anyone until they let her call me. They had found bruises on her arms when her sleeve rode up during an assessment. When gently questioned, she had become hysterical, repeating my name and begging to go home. I spent the night planning, my mind racing through possibilities while guilt gnawed at my insides. That night was the longest of my life. I paced the floor of Marcus's apartment, wearing a path in his thin carpet as I tried to formulate a plan. The walls of his studio were thin enough that we could hear neighbors arguing on one side and a baby crying on the other. The single window overlooked a brick wall, offering no distraction from my spiraling thoughts. Marcus sat at his small kitchen table, nursing a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, occasionally offering suggestions or making calls to people who might help. Every scenario I considered seemed to end in disaster. If I went to the police, they might return Lacey to our parents as her legal guardians. If I confronted Greg and Leah directly, they could claim I was the unstable one. The legal system wasn't designed to believe teenagers over adults, especially when those adults had managed to obtain emergency temporary guardianship papers, which I later learned Leah had done, claiming I was having a mental health crisis and had abandoned Lacey. I needed to get Lacey out during one of my supervised visits, the only time I'd be allowed to see her without violating the restraining order Leah had somehow obtained against me, claiming I was unstable and threatening when I'd confronted her about what happened. The restraining order had arrived via a stone-faced sheriff's deputy who found me at work. The legal document crumpled slightly from being shoved in his pocket. My manager had watched with suspicious eyes as I was served, probably assuming I was some kind of criminal. The paper itself was intimidating, full of legal jargon and accusations that painted me as dangerous and delusional. According to Leah's statement, I had threatened violence against her family when she kindly took in my troubled sister. The deputy had seemed bored, clearly viewing this as routine paperwork, rather than the destruction of my ability to protect Lacey. Marcus, my co-worker who'd become my only real friend through this nightmare, helped me set everything up. A burner phone, $500 in cash withdrawn in small amounts over several days, and a safe place to stay temporarily. Marcus was the kind of friend I never expected to have. The type who, when you show up at their door at 2 a.m. with a crisis, just steps aside and asks what you need. We weren't even particularly close before this. He was just the guy I sometimes shared lunch breaks with at the grocery store. But when I explained what was happening, his expression had hardened with determination. My mom went through something similar with my little brother, he'd said simply. I know what it's like when the system fails the people who need it most. His apartment became our war room. The kitchen table disappeared under maps, bus schedules, and legal printouts from websites Marcus found. His laptop constantly displayed different tabs of research: how to document abuse, what constitutes legal guardianship, where to find emergency housing for minors. The burner phone was a cheap flip model, purchased with cash from a convenience store 2 towns over. Marcus's cousin's cabin became the X on our escape map. Remote enough to be safe, close enough to be reachable. His cousin owned a cabin about 3 hours north, completely off the grid. No internet, no cell service, no nosy neighbors. The cabin existed in a legal gray area, technically on private property, but so remote that it wasn't included in most county records. Marcus showed me photos: a small wooden structure nestled among pine trees, with a stone fireplace and windows that looked out over a creek. It had the basics: running water from a well, electricity from solar panels, a wood stove for heat. Most importantly, it had obscurity. The dirt road leading to it wasn't on GPS, and the mailbox at the main road displayed a different name and address. When Saturday came, I arrived early and scoped out the community center where our supervised visits were held. There was a back exit near the bathrooms. That would be our escape route. The community center was a squat brick building that had once been a school, its institutional architecture softened only slightly by half-hearted attempts at decoration. Posters about community events, a sad-looking potted plant in the corner. I arrived an hour before our scheduled meeting, parking across the street where I could observe the comings and goings. The morning was overcast, a light drizzle making the pavement glisten under the streetlights. I counted 3 visible security cameras, one at the main entrance, one in the parking lot, and one near the side door. None covered the emergency exit behind the building. Inside, I moved with casual purpose, a clipboard in hand to look official as I noted the location of every exit, the timing of receptionist shift changes, and the blind spots in the hallway monitoring. The building smelled of industrial cleaner and instant coffee, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead as I mapped our escape route in my mind. Mrs. Patel, my former high school teacher who'd always had a soft spot for me, agreed to be our getaway driver, waiting in the parking lot behind the building with her engine running. Mrs. Patel had been my English teacher 3 years earlier, a tiny woman with enormous glasses and an even bigger heart. When I'd explained the situation, leaving out nothing, she had listened with growing horror, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "What you're describing is trafficking, Jack," she'd said finally, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I can't stand by and let this happen to a child." Her silver sedan was nondescript enough to blend in anywhere, just another middle-aged woman running errands on a Saturday. My heart nearly stopped when Leah walked in with Lacey. My sister looked different, her eyes vacant and unfocused, her movements mechanical and stiff, wearing a long-sleeved turtleneck despite the warm weather. The waiting area was painted a cheerful yellow that did nothing to dispel the institutional feel of the space. Plastic chairs lined the walls, their legs scraping against the linoleum floor whenever someone shifted their weight. A water cooler gurgled in the corner, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense silence. When the front door opened, the electronic chime announcing new arrivals made me jump. Lacey entered first, her step small and hesitant, nothing like her usual bouncy gait. The turtleneck was at least 2 sizes too large, the fabric bunching around her thin frame. Her hair, usually in a neat ponytail, hung limp and unwashed around her face. But it was her eyes that haunted me. The light that had always animated her features, even in her most difficult moments, had been extinguished. She looked like a shell of herself, moving through the world on autopilot. Greg followed behind them, his hand firmly on Lacey's shoulder, fingers digging in just enough to remind her who was in control. He was a large man, not tall but broad, with a beard that didn't quite hide the softness of his jaw. His flannel shirt was rolled up to the elbows, revealing forearms covered in dark hair and a watch that looked expensive, incongruous with the rest of his deliberately rugged appearance. His fingers splayed across Lacey's small shoulder like a spider, the pressure of his grip evident in the way the fabric of her shirt bunched under his hand. When he smiled at the receptionist, his teeth were too white, too perfect, the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "You have 1 hour," Leah said coldly, her voice nothing like the sympathetic tone she'd used on the phone days earlier. Leah had transformed from the quirky, spiritual aunt I remembered into someone unrecognizable. Her flowing clothes had been replaced by a tailored blazer and slacks, her long hair pulled back in a severe bun. The crystal pendants were gone, replaced by a single gold cross that caught the fluorescent light. Her voice had lost its dreamy quality, now sharp and clinical as she consulted her watch. The smell of expensive perfume surrounded her, something with sandalwood and vanilla that seemed to fill the small waiting area. Tanya, a tired-looking social worker with dark circles under her eyes and a permanent frown, nodded at me. "Please stay in this room at all times. If you need to use the restroom, I'll accompany Lacey to the waiting area." Tanya looked like she had seen too much in her career, her posture perpetually slumped, her clothing practical but rumpled, as if she'd slept in it. Her clipboard had coffee stains on the edges, and she chewed her pen cap as she made notes about our interaction. The room she led us to was small and deliberately cheerful. In that way, spaces designed for difficult situations often are. Bright posters about feelings on the walls, a bookshelf filled with worn board games, chairs arranged in a circle to facilitate conversation. As we played Uno, I whispered instructions whenever Tanya glanced at her phone. "I'm getting you out of here today. When I say I need to use the bathroom, ask if you can go too. Say, your stomach hurts." She won't want details. The Uno cards were worn at the edges, some bearing mysterious stains from countless children who had handled them before us. The plastic table between us was scratched with initials and doodles from previous visitors. Each time I played a card, I leaned forward slightly, my voice dropping to a whisper that wouldn't carry to Tanya's ears. Lacey's hands trembled as she held her cards, the paper making a soft rustling sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. When we get to the hallway, I continued during another moment when Tanya was distracted by a text message. "There's an emergency exit by the water fountain. Mrs. Patel is waiting in a silver car right outside. Can you remember that?" Lacey gave an almost imperceptible nod, her eyes darting briefly to mine before returning to her cards. Lacey nodded almost imperceptibly, her fingers trembling as she placed a card on the pile. The red skip card she played seemed symbolic somehow. We were about to skip out on this entire situation. Her fingernails were bitten to the quick, I noticed, with tiny spots of dried blood around the cuticles. When she reached for another card, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing a bracelet of purple bruises around her wrist, the kind that come from being grabbed too hard. When the moment came, Mrs. Patel created a distraction by entering the center and loudly arguing with the receptionist about a fictional appointment. Mrs. Patel's voice carried through the building, her normally soft-spoken demeanor replaced by indignant volume. "I've been on your schedule for weeks," she insisted, her accent becoming more pronounced as she escalated the confrontation. "This is completely unacceptable. I drove 40 minutes to get here." The receptionist's flustered responses created a perfect backdrop of chaos, drawing the attention of everyone in the vicinity. In the commotion, with Tanya momentarily distracted by the raised voices, Lacey complained of stomach pain and asked to use the bathroom. "My stomach really hurts," Lacey whispered, her arms wrapping around her middle in a convincing display of discomfort. Her face contorted slightly, eyebrows drawing together as she shifted in her seat. "I need to go to the bathroom right now." The urgency in her voice was perfect, not overdone, just a child in genuine discomfort. Tanya hesitated, glancing between us and the front desk, where the argument was escalating. "Fine, quickly," she said, leading us toward the hallway, but keeping her attention split between us and the commotion. The hallway was long and institutional, with scuffed linoleum floors that squeaked under our shoes. Motivational posters lined the walls, faded images of eagles soaring and mountains being climbed, with phrases about perseverance and teamwork. The bathroom was at the far end, past the water fountain that gurgled and sputtered each time someone used it. Tanya walked slightly ahead of us, her attention divided between her vibrating phone and the commotion at the front desk. As we passed the emergency exit, I grabbed Lacey's hand and we sprinted through the door, the alarm blaring behind us as we raced toward Mrs. Patel's waiting car. The emergency bar was cold under my palm as I pushed it with all my strength, the door swinging open with a rush of fresh air and freedom. The alarm was deafening, a high-pitched wail that seemed to physically push against our eardrums. Lacey flinched at the sound but kept running, her small hand clutching mine with surprising strength. The parking lot asphalt was still wet from earlier rain, our feet splashing through puddles as we sprinted toward the silver sedan, idling exactly where it was supposed to be. We made it inside just as Leah reached us, her face contorted with rage as she pounded on the windows and screamed that this was kidnapping, that I was mentally unstable, that she'd have me arrested. Leah's fists made dull thuds against the car window, her manicured nails scraping against the glass like claws. Spittle flew from her mouth as she screamed, her carefully constructed facade of normalcy completely shattered. Behind her, Greg was running across the parking lot, his face purple with rage, a security guard trailing behind him looking confused about who to stop. Mrs. Patel calmly drove away, her hands steady on the wheel as Lacey curled into a ball on the back seat, hands over her ears to block out the noise. "Seatbelts, please," Mrs. Patel said calmly, as if we were simply leaving after a normal visit, rather than fleeing a potentially dangerous situation. Her hands never wavered on the steering wheel, her speed exactly at the limit as we pulled onto the main road. In the rearview mirror, I could see security guards pouring out of the building, Leah gesticulating wildly as she pointed in our direction. But Mrs. Patel simply turned at the next intersection, putting a building between us and our pursuers. The cabin was small but comfortable, hidden among dense pine trees that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the wooden floor. The scent of pine sap and wood smoke greeted us as we entered, the door creaking slightly on its hinges. Inside, the main room combined living area and kitchen, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall. The furniture was mismatched but sturdy, a plaid couch with a handmade quilt folded over its back, 2 armchairs with worn leather seats, a wooden coffee table bearing rings from countless mugs. The kitchen consisted of open shelving stocked with basic supplies, a propane stove, and a sink with a pump handle. 2 doors led off the main room, one to a small bedroom with bunk beds, the other to a bathroom with a clawfoot tub and a composting toilet. After Mrs. Patel left the next morning with promises to return with supplies in a few days, I sat down with Lacey at the small kitchen table. "We need to talk about what happened," I said gently, pushing a mug of hot chocolate toward her. The morning light streamed through the windows in dusty beams, illuminating the steam rising from our mugs. Outside, birds called to each other in the trees, their cheerful sounds a stark contrast to the conversation we needed to have. The wooden table between us was scarred with years of use, initials carved into the corner, burn marks from hot pans, a watercolor stain that had never quite dried properly. Lacey's hands started doing the thumb-circling thing beneath her sleeves, her eyes fixed on the steam rising from her cup. "They'll find us," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Greg said he always finds bad girls who tell secrets." Her voice had a hollow quality that hadn't been there before, as if something essential had been scraped out of her. The thumb circling had become more pronounced, more desperate. No longer the subtle, self-soothing technique I'd taught her, but a frantic movement that seemed beyond her control. Her hot chocolate remained untouched, the marshmallows I'd added slowly melting into a white swirl on the surface. Slowly, painfully, she revealed what had happened during those 3 days at Leah and Greg's house. Greg had been coming into her room almost every night. Leah knew. She'd sometimes stand in the doorway watching, her face expressionless. The cabin grew silent as she spoke, even the birds outside seeming to hush as her story unfolded in halting, fragmented sentences. The sunlight that had seemed warm and comforting earlier now felt harsh, exposing, as if spotlighting our helplessness. I had to force myself to breathe normally, to keep my expression calm despite the rage and horror building inside me with each word she spoke. "He said it was therapy," she whispered, her eyes never leaving the table, "that he was fixing me, that this is what happens to girls who are different." Her voice broke on the last word, a single tear splashing onto the wooden surface between us. "She told me I deserved it," Lacey said, tears streaming down her face, "that I was broken, and this was my punishment for being different, that normal girls don't act like me." The cruelty of those words hung in the air between us, almost tangible in their viciousness. Lacey's shoulders hunched forward as if trying to make herself smaller, less visible. Her tears fell silently now, years of learning to cry without making noise, evident in the way her body shook without sound. I recorded everything on my phone and took pictures of the bruises on her arms and legs. We needed evidence to build our case, to ensure she would never have to go back there. The documentation was clinical, necessary, and heartbreaking. Each bruise told its own story. Fingerprints on her upper arms where she'd been grabbed too hard, circular marks on her legs that matched the end of Greg's cigarettes, the ring of bruises around her wrists from being restrained. The cabin's bathroom had the best light, so we used it for the photographs, the ancient medicine cabinet mirror reflecting my grim expression as I carefully catalogued each injury. Lacey stood still throughout the process, her face blank, as if she had mentally transported herself somewhere else. Through Mrs. Patel's careful networking, I connected with other families with similar stories. Leah and Greg had a history of taking in vulnerable relatives, isolating them, abusing them, and then using threats and legal maneuvering to silence anyone who questioned them. The pattern was disturbingly consistent. Mrs. Patel brought folders of information during her next visit: newspaper, clippings, social media posts from concerned relatives, even a police report that had been filed but mysteriously dropped. Greg and Leah had perfected their system over years: identify vulnerable children, convince family members they could provide better care, obtain temporary guardianship through manipulation or fabricated emergencies, then isolate the children completely. Their home was always just remote enough to make regular check-ins difficult, but not so isolated as to raise suspicion. I reached out to Ms. Bennett, the school counselor who had helped Lacey get diagnosed. She brought Lacey's school records and introduced us to Dr. Catherine Barnes, a pediatrician who specialized in abuse cases involving children with special needs. Ms. Bennett arrived at the cabin on a Tuesday afternoon, her car carefully parked behind a stand of trees to avoid being visible from the main road. She brought not only Lacey's records but also supplies, books appropriate for Lacey's reading level, sensory toys that might help her process trauma, and a weighted blanket that immediately became Lacey's security item. The familiar scent of Ms. Bennett's herbal tea filled the cabin as she spread documents across the kitchen table, creating a timeline of Lacey's development and the interventions that had helped her. Dr. Barnes documented the clear evidence of physical and sexual abuse, her gentle hands and soft voice helping Lacey through the examination. The examination took place in the cabin's bedroom, transformed temporarily into a medical space with clean sheets and privacy screens Mrs. Patel had brought. Dr. Barnes had kind eyes and moved with deliberate slowness, explaining each step before she took it. "I'm going to look at your arm now. Is that okay?" she would ask, waiting for Lacey's nod before proceeding. Her medical bag contained not only the standard equipment, but also items specifically chosen to help children with sensory sensitivities: soft cloths instead of paper gowns, unscented products, and even a small stuffed animal that she offered Lacey to squeeze when things became too overwhelming. With her report, Ms. Bennett's documentation, and the testimonies we'd gathered from other family members, we approached Amelia Leroy, a social worker who specialized in cases involving children with disabilities. Amelia's office was in a converted Victorian house downtown, the interior warm and inviting, despite the serious nature of her work. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with resources on child development, disability rights, and legal protections for vulnerable populations. Her desk was organized chaos, stacks of files and legal pads covered in neat handwriting, family photos in mismatched frames, and a collection of fidget toys for her clients' use during difficult conversations. "You've taken an enormous risk," Amelia told me, her eyes serious behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Technically, you did violate a court order. However, given the overwhelming evidence of abuse, I believe we can make a case for emergency circumstances that justified your actions." The gravity of our situation wasn't lost on me as Amelia laid out both the risks and possibilities. Her office smelled faintly of coffee and old books, a comforting combination that somehow made her straightforward assessment easier to hear. Outside her window, normal life continued. People walking dogs, mail carriers delivering packages, children riding bikes along the sidewalk. The contrast between that ordinary world and the nightmare we'd been living in made me dizzy for a moment. The investigation moved quickly once the right people became involved. Police found disturbing evidence in Leah and Greg's house, hidden cameras in Lacey's bedroom, journals documenting abuse, and evidence they'd done the same to other children who had stayed with them over the years. The search warrant was executed on a Wednesday morning, the culmination of weeks of careful evidence gathering and legal maneuvering. Detective Rivera, a specialist in crimes against children, led the team that entered Leah and Greg's house. The evidence they uncovered was even more damning than we'd anticipated, not just documentation of current abuse, but a systematic record stretching back nearly 15 years. Greg's journals were particularly incriminating, detailing his methods for breaking children's spirits and ensuring their silence. The hidden cameras had been installed in air vents, smoke detectors, and even inside stuffed animals placed strategically around the rooms where children slept. Greg was arrested on multiple counts of child abuse, with Leah charged as an accomplice. More victims came forward, some from decades ago, their stories eerily similar to Lacey's. The news coverage was carefully managed to protect the identities of the victims, but the basic facts became public knowledge. A respected couple in the community had been systematically abusing vulnerable children placed in their care. The story broke like a thunderclap, sending shockwaves through their social circles and the broader community. Former friends and neighbors expressed shock and disbelief. The standard refrain of "they seemed so normal" repeated in interviews and social media posts. As more victims found the courage to come forward, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. Children who had stayed with Greg and Leah shared specific details that couldn't have been coordinated. Particular phrases Greg used during abuse, specific locations in the house where it occurred, even the same threats to ensure silence. Our parents were also charged with child endangerment and neglect for their treatment of Lacey, and for failing to protect her after placing her with Leah and Greg. The detective who interviewed our parents reported that they seemed more concerned about the public embarrassment than about what had happened to Lacey. They maintained that they had no idea what Greg and Leah were capable of, despite evidence that similar allegations had circulated within the family for years. Their house was searched as part of the investigation. The closet under the stairs photographed and measured as evidence of inappropriate discipline and confinement. The question of who would have permanent custody of Lacey remained unanswered as the legal proceedings dragged on. Mrs. Patel offered a solution. She could become Lacey's legal guardian, with me living there as her primary caretaker. Mrs. Patel's home was a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood, with a fenced backyard and a kitchen that always smelled of cardamom and ginger. She had converted her home office into a bedroom for Lacey, painting the walls a soft blue that Lacey had chosen from color samples. Together we assembled furniture from IKEA, the instructions spread across the carpet as we figured out which screws went where. Mrs. Patel hung blackout curtains to help with Lacey's light sensitivity, and installed a white noise machine to mask the unfamiliar sounds of a new neighborhood. It wasn't perfect, but it might work until I could establish myself more firmly and petition for full custody. The arrangement had its challenges. I was still working and trying to attend community college part-time, while Mrs. Patel had her teaching job and other responsibilities. We created elaborate schedules on the refrigerator, color-coded to show who would be with Lacey at all times. The legal limbo we existed in meant constant meetings with lawyers, court appearances, and interviews with various officials, each one requiring time off work or school. Meanwhile, I focused on helping Lacey heal. She had nightmares almost every night and had developed new stimming behaviors, rocking violently and hitting herself when overwhelmed by memories or sensory input. The nightmares followed a pattern we quickly learned to recognize. Around 2 a.m., Lacey would begin whimpering in her sleep, the sound escalating until she woke screaming, disoriented and terrified. I kept a sleeping bag on the floor of her room for those nights, ready to provide reassurance without crowding her. We developed a routine. I would turn on the small lamp by her bed, never the overhead light which was too harsh, hand her the weighted blanket, and sit nearby without touching her until she indicated she was ready for comfort. The self-harming behaviors were harder to address. When triggered by a memory or an overwhelming sensation, Lacey would begin hitting her forehead with her fists, sometimes hard enough to leave bruises. We tried various interventions, compression gloves, stress balls, redirection techniques, with mixed success. The bathroom became a safe space for her, the lock allowing her privacy when she needed to stim without feeling observed or judged. Dr. Sage Corey, a therapist specializing in trauma and autism, began working with Lacey, using techniques specifically designed for children on the spectrum who had experienced abuse. Dr. Corey's office was unlike any therapy space I'd seen before. Instead of a traditional couch and chair arrangement, it had various seating options, beanbags, rocking chairs, a small trampoline in the corner, and a tent-like structure where clients could retreat if they needed a break from visual stimulation. The lighting was adjustable, and the walls were painted a soothing green that Lacey said reminded her of trees. Rather than expecting Lacey to sit still and talk about her feelings, an approach that would have been disastrous given her autism and trauma, Dr. Corey used art, movement, and play to help her process what had happened. Sand trays with miniature figures allowed Lacey to create scenes that expressed her experiences when words failed her. A punching bag in the corner gave her a safe outlet for the rage that sometimes overwhelmed her. Recovery isn't linear, Dr. Corey reminded me during one of our sessions. The important thing is that Lacey knows she's safe now, and that what happened wasn't her fault. Your consistency is her anchor. We met with Dr. Corey in her office's small kitchenette, while Lacey worked with an art therapist in the main space. The room smelled of herbal tea and the chocolate chip cookies Dr. Corey always had available for family members. Through the observation window, I could see Lacey carefully arranging colored sand in patterns that Dr. Corey had explained represented her attempt to create order from chaos. There will be setbacks, Dr. Corey continued. stirring honey into her tea. Days when it seems like all your progress has vanished. But those aren't failures. They're part of the healing process. The steam from her mug fogged her glasses slightly as she leaned forward to emphasize her point. What matters most is that you're still here, still showing up, still believing in her capacity to heal. On the day of the custody hearing, Judge Baker reviewed all our documentation, her expression grave as she flipped through the photographs and medical reports. The courtroom was smaller than I'd expected, nothing like the grand spaces shown on television dramas. The wooden benches were worn smooth from years of anxious people waiting for their cases to be called. The air conditioning hummed too loudly, occasionally making it difficult to hear soft-spoken witnesses. Judge Baker's bench was elevated only slightly above the rest of the room, but her presence commanded attention. Her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp and assessing as she reviewed each document. My parents had filed a counter-petition, trying to regain custody by claiming they'd been misled about Leah and Greg's character, and that they deserved another chance. They sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, my mother in a conservative dress I'd never seen before, my father in a suit that looked newly purchased. Their attorney was a slick-looking man with an expensive watch and a leather briefcase that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. They had prepared a display of family photos, carefully selected images showing happy moments that told nothing of the reality we had lived. The sight of them sitting there, presenting themselves as concerned, loving parents, made my stomach churn with anger and disbelief. When it was Lacey's turn to speak, her voice was surprisingly steady. "I have autism. Jack figured it out when I was 8. He taught me how to stim without anyone seeing." She demonstrated the thumb circling. "He bought me these headphones when noises got too loud." Lacey sat in the witness chair, her feet barely touching the ground. She wore a blue dress Mrs. Patel had helped her pick out, chosen specifically because the fabric didn't irritate her sensitive skin. Her hair was neatly braided, the ends secured with blue ribbons that matched her dress. Despite her small size, she somehow filled the room with her presence as she spoke her truth. She described our parents' reaction to her diagnosis, then more haltingly, what happened with Leah and Greg. "They said no one would believe me because I'm broken, but I'm not broken. I'm just different. Jack always knew that." As she recounted the abuse, her voice became quieter, but remained clear. She clutched a small fidget cube in her hand, her fingers working the buttons and switches as she spoke. The courtroom was completely silent, every person present seemingly holding their breath as this small, brave girl told her story without flinching from the terrible details. Judge Baker granted custody to Mrs. Patel, with me continuing as Lacey's primary support person. Our parents received no visitation rights, their petition dismissed with a scathing rebuke from the judge about their failure to protect their vulnerable child. Judge Baker's ruling was delivered in a voice that brooked no argument, her words precise and carefully chosen. The evidence presented demonstrates a pattern of neglect and emotional abuse in the parents' home, followed by their catastrophic failure to verify the safety of the placement they chose for their daughter. The sound of her gavel striking the wooden block echoed through the courtroom, a period at the end of one chapter of our lives and the beginning of another. Outside the courthouse, Lacey surprised me by approaching our parents as they stood with their attorney. "I forgive you," she said simply, her voice clear in the hushed corridor. "Not for you, for me to feel better." The marble hallway amplified her small voice, making it carry to everyone nearby. Our parents stood frozen, clearly unprepared for this confrontation. My mother's carefully applied makeup couldn't hide the shock in her eyes. My father's hand tightened on his briefcase until his knuckles turned white. Their attorney shifted uncomfortably, suddenly finding his shoes fascinating. Lacey didn't wait for their response. She simply turned away, took my hand, and walked toward the sunlight streaming through the courthouse doors. Her steps were lighter than I'd seen in months, as if the act of speaking her truth, both in the courtroom and to our parents, had lifted some of the weight she'd been carrying. The next few months were about building a new normal. Mrs. Patel's house became home, its sunny kitchen and quiet backyard garden providing the stability Lacey needed. We established routines that provided the predictability Lacey thrived on, while allowing flexibility for her ongoing recovery. Mornings began with breakfast at the round kitchen table, sunlight streaming through the east-facing windows as we planned our day. The refrigerator door became a communication center, covered with visual schedules, emotion charts, and reminder notes. The backyard garden became Lacey's special project, the repetitive tasks of weeding and watering soothing her nervous system, while the visible results of her care gave her a sense of accomplishment. I got a job at a local bookstore that worked around my college schedule, finally pursuing the education I'd put on hold. The bookstore was a haven of quiet and order, with clearly defined tasks and minimal sensory overload. I worked primarily in the stockroom, processing new shipments and organizing returns, though occasionally I would help customers find specific titles. The owner, Ms. Abernathy, was a former special education teacher who understood my need for a flexible schedule and sometimes let Lacey sit in the children's section after school. reading or doing homework until my shift ended. Community college classes were challenging after so many years focused solely on Lacey's needs, but also invigorating. I started with just 2 courses, Introduction to Psychology and English Composition, my backpack filled with new notebooks and textbooks that smelled of possibility. The campus was small enough to be navigable, but large enough to offer resources like tutoring and counseling services. Slowly, I began to reclaim parts of myself that had been set aside during the crisis. Dr. Corey continued working with Lacey, and gradually the nightmares became less frequent, the self-harming behaviors less intense. Progress came in small, sometimes barely perceptible increments. The night Lacey slept through until morning for the first time, I sat at the kitchen table and cried with relief, the morning sunlight warming my face as I realized we'd passed a milestone. The first time she laughed, really laughed, not the forced sound she'd been making to appear normal. We all froze, then joined in, the sound filling Mrs. Patel's kitchen and spilling out through the open windows into the garden. 6 months later, I came home to find Lacey and Mrs. Patel watching Lacey's favorite movie, the one that had triggered the hand-flapping incident that revealed her diagnosis to our parents. The living room was cozy in the early evening light, lamps creating pools of golden illumination against the approaching dusk. The smell of popcorn, made on the stove with real butter, not the microwave kind, filled the air. Mrs. Patel had created a nest of pillows and blankets on the floor, knowing Lacey preferred to watch movies from a soft space where she could move freely if needed. The familiar opening music filled the room, and I paused in the doorway, my heart in my throat, as I waited to see how Lacey would respond. As the scene that had once caused such an extreme reaction approached, Lacey's hands began to flutter slightly, a small, controlled movement that expressed her joy without the overwhelming intensity of before. Her face lit up with genuine happiness, unencumbered by fear of judgment or punishment. The movement was gentler now, more contained, but unmistakably the same expression of joy that had once terrified our parents. Mrs. Patel smiled at her, completely unfazed by the stimming, occasionally glancing at Lacey with the warm acceptance that had become the foundation of our new life. The contrast between this moment and that fateful evening years ago couldn't have been more profound. Same movie, same reaction, but now surrounded by understanding instead of fear and judgment. That night, as I tucked Lacey in, she asked, "Jack, am I still the same person I was before?" Her room was bathed in the soft glow of her constellation nightlight. Stars and planets projected onto the ceiling in gentle blue light. Her weighted blanket was pulled up to her chin, its pressure providing the deep sensory input that helped her feel secure. On her bedside table, a glass of water, her current favorite book, and a small jar containing her collection of smooth stones were arranged in the precise order she preferred. "What happened to you was terrible," I said honestly, sitting on the edge of her bed. "It changed you because trauma changes everyone it touches, but your autism, your kindness, all the things that make you you, those didn't change." The mattress dipped slightly under my weight as I chose my words carefully, wanting to be truthful without overwhelming her. Outside her window, crickets chirped in the garden, a gentle backdrop to our conversation. A car passed on the street, its headlights briefly illuminating the room before continuing on, leaving us in the peaceful dimness again. "So I'm still me, just a different version?" "Exactly. And this version is just as amazing as the one before, maybe even more amazing because now you know how strong you are." As I turned to leave, Lacey called my name one more time. "Jack, thank you for not giving up on me." I smiled at her, my heart full despite everything we'd been through. Never have, never will. The door creaked slightly as I pulled it partially closed, leaving it open just enough to let the hallway light spill in, a compromise between her need for some light and her growing desire for privacy. In that sliver of illumination, I could see her turning onto her side, pulling her stuffed otter close to her chest, her eyes already closing with the security of knowing she was safe, protected, and most importantly, understood. As I walked down the hallway toward my own room, the floorboards warm under my bare feet, I felt a sense of peace that had been absent for so long. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be court dates and therapy sessions, setbacks and challenges, but for the first time, I truly believed we would be okay. Not because everything was perfect, but because we had found people who saw us clearly and still chose to stand beside us. Because Lacey was healing. Because I was learning that taking care of her didn't mean I couldn't also take care of myself. In the quiet of Mrs. Patel's house, with the distant sound of Lacey's peaceful breathing from down the hall, I allowed myself to acknowledge a simple truth. Families aren't always what we're born into. Sometimes they're what we build, piece by piece, from the wreckage of what was supposed to protect us, but didn't. And sometimes, those rebuilt families are stronger than the original ever could have been.